Welcome, everyone, back to the AMR Origin series, the series where we spend some time uncovering how AMR authors came up with the ideas, the paths that their papers took as they developed those ideas, both in the initial drafts and then through the review process. My name's Greg Fisher, and I'm your host. And today we're discussing a fascinating paper, the commercialization of the practice of voyeurism, how organizations leverage authenticity and transgression to create value. And in order to do this, we're joined by the four authors of this paper in episode 25 of the AMR Origin series. So I'm just going to ask them to each introduce themselves, Trish, Sean, Maxim, and Madeline. So Trish, if we can start with you.
Sure. I'm Trish Ruebottom, and I'm an associate professor at McMaster University in Hamilton in Canada. And I broadly study processes of social change, but specifically focused on marginalized groups and stigmatized contexts.
Awesome. Thank you. Sean?
Hi, I'm Sean Buchanan. I'm associate professor of business administration at the Asper School of Business, which is at the University of Manitoba in Canada. And my research, it really doesn't belong in a business school. Let's just get that out of the way. I study social and environmental issues in and around capitalism and management.
Awesome. Thank you. Maxim.
My name is Maxim Voronov. I'm professor of sustainability and organization studies at the Schulich School of Business at York University in Canada. Although currently I'm on sabbatical as a visiting scholar at the INSEAD in France. And my research revolves around social change and draws on institutional theory and gets into culture, cultural processes, and emotions.
Madeline.
Hi, I'm Madeline Toubiana. I am an associate professor of entrepreneurship and organization at the Telfer School of Management at the University of Ottawa, also in Canada. So we have a big Canadian team here. And my research, it's similar. You're going to see a similar theme, I guess, across all of us. I study what stalls and fosters social change. And I have a specific influence or interest in the role of institutional processes, stigma, and emotions in influencing those processes.
Cool. So there are clearly some connections in your sort of research identities there. But then we land up with this paper, which is commercializing the practice of voyeurism. So can one of you first just tell me the idea of voyeurism, what it is?
So I can start with that one. So voyeurism is one of those things, you know it when you see it, but it actually took quite a lot for us to say, okay, what's our actual definition that then follows and theoretically aligns and all of that? So voyeurism is a look at something that is supposed to be private. So it's a look at the forbidden, basically. And the idea actually came from an email. And voyeurism was the core of the idea right from the very start. So I got an email, and it was about a blog post on slum tourism. And the heading of it had voyeurism right in the title. And I was working on a project in the sex industry with Madeline. And I had just done an interview with an erotic webcam model, and it was a great interview, and I was still thinking about it. And that's also a very voyeuristic context. And so that word voyeurism just jumped out at me. And that was what I wanted to study. I wanted to figure it out. I wanted to make sense of it because of those two very, very, very different contexts that both spoke to voyeurism.
And then how did you come to the conclusion that this could be an AMR paper or a conceptual paper?
Okay, so that's a bit trickier. So I sat on the paper for a long time. Madeline and I were in the middle of another project and we needed to finish things up. So we just kind of pushed it to the side as something too complicated to deal with. It wasn't coming directly from our empirical context, but it definitely related, especially the webcam side of it. But we couldn't really deal with it within that project. So we just put it to the side and didn't think about it. And then I was sketching out ideas on the way home from a conference. I think it was the Boston AOM conference a while back. And I ran into Maxim in the airport. And so I was sketching down all sorts of ideas. I had no idea what I was doing or what kind of paper it would be. And Maxim and I spent the entire flight home talking about what the paper could be. And he just had such a strong theoretical anchor to it. He was talking about authenticity, and it really changed what I thought the paper could be. And that was where I first thought, okay, we have something here. It's really different, but I could see it. It needed to be a theory paper from everything that our conversation was. And I knew I couldn't do that myself. So then I talked to all of the people here and everyone jumped on board. But I think right from those early ideas, when we brought in authenticity and we had the transgression from the beginning, we kind of knew it was going to be a theory paper and that we were going to aim for AMR.
Maxim, how did you sort of begin to connect theoretical ideas with this sort of phenomenon that's out there? And what was your sort of, if you can try and go back there, thought process of trying to layer on or incorporate a theoretical angle into this fascinating phenomenon?
Well, it just struck me as this was not something we had a theory for. So from my conversation with Trish, it was very easy to see that there was some unique phenomenon, and that there wasn't really a theory that we could plug into it. I mean, that without really distorting the nature of this phenomenon. So I think that's pretty much as close as I can reproduce the recollection of that. But really, just I think it's sort of, I think maybe kind of like being a qualitative researcher, that you're kind of trying to do justice to the phenomenon and without distorting it too much. And it's sort of, and I sort of had that sort of kind of feeling that, well, this is a very distinct phenomenon that we can find in different contexts, but the theories that we have just don't do justice to it.
And I think, Maxim, you come at everything from a conceptual angle. You're so theoretically driven that's your natural position. So I think that accidental conversation we had in the airport is really, that was the turning point for it, because that's Maxim's orientation to everything.
And by the way, can I insert here that Trish goes to every single conference and comes home with like 6 new ideas for a paper. She's actually out of her mind. She shows up at AOM and she goes, okay, I want to do this. And I was thinking on the plane about this. And then she's meeting with people and she's sketching out ideas for papers. She gets hugely inspired when she goes to conferences.
I do. It's very true.
This conference, do the same thing that you did with this paper for 3 other papers.
Yes.
That connect to different ideas that we're having. And I think that, what was cool about this paper is that we had a model of an AMR that could be like this, right? Because that was on your mind, Trish. And that because it was phenomenon based, at first I'm trying to imagine, because I'm empirical focused. So I kept going back and wanted to think about it. I had to go watch more videos, but we had that anchor of a paper. And then with the theoretical ideas and orientation of Maxim as an AMR expert, I guess, it helped us think that it was possible to do a piece like this, because I don't think it's the way you would traditionally come to it.
So can you help me double down a little bit on the sort of the phenomenon? Because we've had 2 examples mentioned so far. So webcams, erotic webcams, if you will. And the email was about sort of slum tourism as being these 2 examples of the private world being made public for someone else's consumption, as it's sort of the phenomenon of this idea of voyeurism. What are some other examples of the phenomenon in play, particularly where it gets sort of utilized for a business or commercial standpoint, which is in the title of your paper? And how did you uncover all these different examples of voyeurism so that you could make the paper not just about one or two instances of it, but as a broader phenomenon that actually shows up in all sorts of different places. So what are some of those examples, and how did you uncover them and develop them as the paper evolved?
So I think that was really important for the development of our paper, was coming up with those examples. As much as it was a theory-driven paper, those examples needed to give us sort of a grounding to say, what is voyeurism, and get out of it to slum tourism, or what's specific to erotic webcam, to say, okay, if we have a whole lot of different examples, what's similar to all of them? And then that was how we identified what the phenomenon of voyeurism was. So we all were very familiar with Wes and Karen's paper on mixed martial arts. So that was an obvious other example that we drew in that seemed to fit, but also be very different. And then reality TV came in a little later in our thinking, where it was something that was much less transgressive than the other ones. And so that really helped push, and Maxim really pushed in that direction too, that this isn't as transgressive and niche, thinking it was when we had erotic webcam and slum tourism and even mixed martial arts. And then thinking reality television, you can push to all sorts of things where it's there, but maybe in lesser degrees. So the news is another example. Even things that are trying to be voyeuristic, like the movement in horror films, where they were trying to look real, and with the Blair Witch Project that came out forever ago now. But there was this rumor that maybe it was real, and that was what got people's attention for what was just another horror movie. So really stretching it to things that were much less transgressive, much more mainstream, and offered sort of a different take on the same underlying phenomenon that was voyeurism.
So Sean, can you unpack for us a little bit about the process of sort of cycling between the phenomenon and what's sort of happening in the world, and evolving it into something that's more general, more conceptual? And what did that process actually look like as this paper evolved? Try and give a sense for someone who's thinking they've discovered an interesting phenomenon but want to make it more theoretical, aren't quite sure how to do that. What did you see behind the scenes in terms of that happening?
Well, this is in many ways was a really interesting learning process for us, because it is a phenomenon-driven paper, and this is a whole different discussion about theory papers that are built from phenomenon, which is very different than sort of your traditional conceptual paper. And so, we had a few examples. We have Andy Crane's modern slavery example, and Blake Ashforth and colleagues have a paper on, what was it again? Anthropomorphizing organizations. And so what's interesting is, because we all do qualitative research, this paper kind of ending up functioning a little bit like a qualitative paper, where we're using these different examples as almost our data to build theory from. And so at some point, Trish and I were on erotic webcam websites looking at their terms, their rules, like their codes of conduct and stuff like that. And I'm like, is this a conceptual paper, or are we looking at data? You know what I mean? And so having these different phenomenons, from mixed martial arts to erotic webcam to slum tourism to reality television to all those things, every time we were sort of theorizing or building our theory, we would run it through each of those different examples and say, does it hold here? Does it hold here? And if it didn't hold, we would elaborate, or we would refine the theory, or we would look at a deeper level, or we would do something like that, very much the way you do in qualitative coding of data, And so that's what made it a fascinating thing. But instead of doing it from raw data, you were doing it from these different examples out in the world. And so it made it a process that I was more familiar with, but a different process, because you're not showing that data in the same way you would in a qualitative piece. And so it functioned, and that's why it was a huge learning experience for me to try and build theory from a phenomenon rather than write a traditional sort of conceptual theory paper. And so I guess that's some thoughts I have on it.
And I think, we also that was a really fun process. It got me hooked on reality TV, which is something I never wanted to admit. But we also, from the beginning, from that conversation, so like Trish and I had transgression in our head, and then Maxim brought in authenticity. So we had these two anchors of theoretical concepts from the beginning. And we were keeping those kind of in mind all the time as we were still connected to the phenomena. So we did have these two kind of theoretical anchors. And then, of course, our interests, our kind of joint interest in emotion. So we were still connected at the theoretical level all the time. You know what I mean? And I think that we kept going back to those. And those core elements didn't change, even though the paper evolved, because we were fundamentally interested in this weird tension between transgression and authenticity, this idea that authenticity is always supposed to be good, transgression is always bad, but it can be the reverse. And how do you manage that? And, so that theoretical puzzle still remained, even though we were so linked to the phenomena. I think all of us were really interested in that little bit of that theoretical puzzle. And I think that was a important nugget that kind of kept us focused.
And I think that's an important piece here. If I read the paper with a sort of an associate editor hat on, is that although it's new theory for the most part, it's not completely coming out of nowhere. There is this piece on authenticity that is sort of borrowed and grounded in the existing literature on authenticity. This piece on transgression, which Trish and Madeline, I suspect you're like, that's sort of part of what your core research identity is associated with. And then there's this piece on emotions, which, we've got a giant literature on emotions and emotional reactions to things. But it's the connecting of those things in interesting ways to be able to explain this phenomenon that makes it valuable. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the evolution of how those things connected and what were some of the sort of theoretical levers that you pulled to make them coalesce in the way that you've made them coalesce? Because people read this thing and it fits. Transgression, authenticity, and emotions fit together very, very nicely. And you've got beautiful tables that sort of elaborate how they fit together. But I should imagine there was some evolution to get to that point of fitting together so nicely. So I don't know, Maxim, can you give us a little bit of a sense of sort of how do you coalesce those things together, and what did that process look like? Were there any things that helped in talking about them, or in sketching things out, or in going back and forth? I'm just interested to know, how do you arrive at something that's sort of precise and good, but in the process I would expect is somewhat messy.
and messy it was at times, because I think we're all fairly enthusiastic about I think different aspects of the paper and different theories, right? Madeline and I have worked on a number of things, and we do tend to get competitive in a constructive sort of way. And Sean is really good, turns out, in mediating and pulling us apart and all that, and which is, I think, a key reason of how things eventually get integrated and cohere nicely. But I think it's an interesting thing, though, and I think it's particularly between Madeline and I, like where we look at it and of course, one of us will say, oh, of course it's transgression. The other one will say, well, of course it's authenticity, right? And so then it becomes a question, okay, well, how do we, bring these things together, right? And I think and Trish is really good at filtering out the nonsense and retaining the stuff that's actually meaningful and useful, right? And so so I guess what I'm saying is that it seems to be more of a, like in this particular case, it's more of an interpersonal process of combining theories in a way that makes sense, more so than kind of purely intellectual or kind of rational process of course, well, these theories, according to so and so, because I can very easily visualize a scenario with a different set of people where these things might never come together actually. Yeah.
And what did it look? What was your mode of operating? Because you're obviously all, for the most part, located in Canada, but not in the same place. So would you jump on Zoom calls and spend time debating things, or was it sending emails back and forth? So as a team of four writing a conceptual paper that has sort of many different aspects to it, and you're all bringing something different to the table, give us a little bit of a sense of your workflow and your work style and communication style to make that work.
That was a bit of all of the above, everything you're talking about. It was a lot of emails, a lot of phone calls, definitely some Zoom. It was trying to find times that we could all be there together, which I think was the hardest part with all our different schedules and different time zones. Even at that, even though we're in Canada, we had 3 different time zones to work with. And that was the hardest part, because if we weren't all in the conversation, it was easy to go down a direction. And then the person who wasn't able to make that call is like, wait, but what about this? And then we had to roll back. So I think it was a very messy back and forth, true iteration style, but using everything we had available, worked and pulled it all together. And I think using the flexibility of all the different tools was really critical.
I also think that you have to give credit to Trish here, because she's the lead and she had to navigate a lot. So she had more conversations than anyone else, because sometimes if we couldn't get all together, she'd have a call with me, then she'd have a call with Maxim, because of course, maybe we were navigating a contentious point, and then she'd have a call with Sean. And so Trish was a really amazing lead author on this. And I think for a team of 4, you need a really strong lead. So I think that we used all those modes, but Trish was our fearless leader and Sean may be the mediator. But I was just reading the paper before this interview and I was like, I'm really proud of where we got, and that's part of this process of working through the kinks of different ideas and what people bring to the table to get there. And we have to have a lot of conversations, but
thanks, Madeline.
You were amazing.
I do think it's important to double click on that you need someone who's going to take that lead and push the paper forward. Can you just give us, you said Boston AOM. I'm not in my mind, I don't even know what year that is. I know the paper was eventually accepted at AMR in 2020, I believe. And so what did the timeline look like? So when was that Boston conference when you first had the idea? How long did it take to get to first submission, and how long did it then take to get through the review process? I just want to give first-time authors a sense of what the time evolution of a conceptual paper like this looks like.
Maxim, do you remember when Boston was?
Actually, it wasn't Boston. Let's not scare who are watching this. It wasn't that long. It was Atlanta, actually.
Okay.
Okay.
So what year was Atlanta?
Okay, that's more complicated. Did I mention I'm not good with numbers?
Let's just put it this way. The people who are interested can just go on the Academy's website and find out when Atlanta was. That's when the germ of the idea was. And I will say what's funny about this is that the review process was extremely supportive. The reviewers and editor were so helpful and so constructive and never and always fed the development of the paper. But you would never know that based on some of our author calls. We were the amount of spirited calls we had. It was like we were going through the most difficult review process of all time, but it really wasn't.
2017.
Okay, there you go.
So
2017.
2017 was the academic conference. You get the idea. It looks like it was submitted in probably about May of 2019, so about 2 years worth of work to get it to submission. But then it seems like a fairly sort of as almost as fast as it can be through the review process. So you obviously took it seriously, responded to reviews quite quickly, and got things going. Was there anything about the review process that you found that was valuable to the paper, or that was valuable to you as a team in terms of responding to reviewers that seemed to work well? Because it appears that you navigated it pretty effectively. And this is something that many authors struggle with, is how do you handle the review process for a conceptual paper where you might be getting pulled in different directions, or where the reviewers have got sort of no end to what they might say about the paper and what they might suggest. So what was your process, and what did you learn from that?
So I think all of our reviewers and the editor were very clear and actually very aligned. That, I think, was one of the reasons it was such a smooth review process for us, is because they were aligned in what they needed. So in that sense, we didn't have to deal with that challenge. And I think that is the hardest challenge, when you have reviewers going in different directions and an editor saying, figure out your path forward. So that can be really tricky, but we didn't have to do that. We had, the core of the paper never really changed. And what we were pushed on was, what's the theoretical hook? Be really, really strong and clear on the theoretical hook, because the empirical grounding was always very clear, but because it's a theory paper, we needed to really push on that. And another thing that they pushed on that we struggled with was our ontological position. So they kept coming back to say, okay, who decides whether something is voyeuristic or not? And it was that simple question that we had to answer, I think, in every stage of the review process, because we didn't quite get it. In the very beginning, when we first submitted, we actually had a 2x2 of where the different examples fit in how authentic they were and how transgressive they were. And we actually decided where they went in that 2x2. And the editorial team was very clear, saying, why do you get to decide that this is voyeuristic or not? What if I disagree? And they kept pushing. We were like, okay, we don't get to decide. It's societal's moral codes that decide whether something is voyeuristic or not. And they said, well, does that mean everyone agrees that something is voyeuristic? What if some people don't think that The Bachelor, the reality television show, is voyeuristic? They think it's perfectly acceptable. And so we had to constantly wrestle with that throughout the whole thing. And they just kept pushing and pushing. And we knew we hadn't quite gotten there. And we just kept trying to keep going. So it was one of those review processes where they asked for similar things. We made some progress, but they pushed us to go further. And we just needed to trust them and to trust ourselves that pushing further, we would find the right way to explain what we were talking about.
And in doing the review, did you tend to try and respond to comments first and then integrate them into the paper, or rewrite the paper first and then write comments? Did you have an ordering effect there that seemed to work better or worse for you?
I think both. And you guys can help me remember what we did. I think we kind of went through piece by piece all of the reviewer comments and sort of jotted down our ideas. And then we went back to the paper to rewrite the paper, and then came back again to the reviewer comments to kind of see if we really got it and how that fit with what we did in the paper.
I want to touch on two things as we sort of move towards the latter part of this interview. And the first is the idea of emotional optimization and arriving at these mechanisms for emotional optimization, which I thought just in and of itself, this notion of emotional optimization, and you might have been sort of pushed in that direction from this, taking this ontological stance as to who decides. But I'd be interested to know how and when you arrived at that, and then thinking through these mechanisms for emotional optimization, which is, in a sense, how do you make, in some senses, how do you make something that might be more morally questionable seem less so, and how do you make something that might seem less authentic seem more authentic? So it's tied into the dimensions that you've got, but really, how did you arrive at, number one, the emotional optimization, and then at the mechanisms that facilitate that?
So that was Sean. Sean saw that so clearly right from the beginning. So I'll let Sean answer that question.
Well, I remember that one of the things that was causing the difficulties with the paper is you have transgression that can operate as a negative and a positive for value creation purposes, and you have authenticity, which can operate as a negative and a positive, which really trips you up because you're trying to explain this phenomena and you have these two aspects of it that both can work in different ways. And it's very hard to theorize around something like that. And when we started to discuss emotions, that was the big eureka, because it said, oh, it's about managing the emotions and how the transgression and authenticity is perceived by the audiences. And then it's funny, earlier on the interview, Greg, you mentioned the word levers. And that's when I remember specifically thinking about managing those levers of authenticity and transgression. And so, the businesses doing this are sort of pulling the strings. And I think the model, I'm not sure, it still kind of exists, but it sort of looks a little bit like a pulley system where emotional optimization is about finding that optimal balance between authenticity and transgression in a way to create value for our audiences. And so as soon as we sort of hit on that mechanism of the emotions being managed to find that sweet spot, then it became that fun game of thinking, oh, well, how do all of these different voyeuristic, these businesses utilizing the practice of voyeurism, how do they do this? And so that's when, we started looking at MMA rules and watching reality television and looking at code of conduct for erotic webcam websites to see how they sort of manage the emotions of audience by sort of pulling the levers of authenticity and transgression. So that became, and what it ended up doing, what was really cool about that is that then it made us kind of switch the way we saw the role of authenticity and transgression. And in switching that provided like really the big aha moment for the theory of this. It's like, it's not about, it's about the management of the emotions that is key in this. And that was, became a kind of a big turning point in the paper and its contribution, I think.
Well, I think that's absolutely critical to recognize that you need to go beyond, if you will, the 2x2 matrix of 2 dimensions and authenticity, and sort of evolve that into something that's more substantive, more theoretical, more insightful. And this idea of emotional optimization and the fact that those dimensions can work in either direction, I think, is a very useful insight. And in some sense, this paper could serve as an exemplar to future papers that sort of grapple with a similar kind of tension, where you've got multiple dimensions that each have both positive and negative aspects, depending on which direction you go. But it's related to how the audience perceives that. And I think about papers on social evaluations and on reputation and legitimacy and all of those things, where it's really dependent on the audience stance as to how things are interpreted. And I think this paper lays a sort of template for how those might be thought of in a more nuanced way than just, positive and negative in each case. So congrats on that. And then the final piece I want to touch on, because I thought it was really well done, was how you set this paper up to be a platform for future research and future ideas. And so I'd love to know just about your process for writing the discussion section, but in particular, sort of how you seed the potential for future research and future ideas. And then just love to know what you each individually see as the most exciting sort of next step for this sort of line of research, or for taking this as a conceptual model and moving it forward. So to start off just by telling me a little bit about the process of writing the sort of ideas for future research, or the platform for future research. I can't remember exactly what you called it in the paper, but I thought it was very well done.
Thank you. So a lot of the stuff that wound up there were things that we were playing with in the paper that we couldn't deal with. So that was a huge part of, okay, we want to get into this whole subsection that goes off on a tangent that deals with the variation between the 4 different examples we're talking about, or goes off into the temporal over time, how like really getting more into all the things that we were already talking about, but at a much more detailed level, and needing to scale it back and say, okay, that is not the core of what we're doing here. We can't fit it all into one paper. And that became sort of the bucket of, okay, I guess it's future research then. Someone else is going to have to take that idea and run with it because we can't make it fit into one paper.
Awesome. And I think it landed up being a very rich section. So I can see that you grappled with quite a lot as you went through writing this paper. So what are the exciting things that you think can come from this work? And maybe in particular, as they sort of relate to each of your own research portfolio, research identity, some of the stuff you do, and or something you'd see as an exciting next step for this paper. What gets you excited in that section? And I'd love to just hear from each of you in that regard.
So I think, like you said, each of us has a different thing probably that excited us. We spent a lot of time thinking about this element of desirable versus undesirable emotions, and the notion that the desirable can be both positive and negative, but also the role of moral emotions. And when they can, and this is part of what Max and I had lots of conversations about. And I want to blow that up. And there's so much potential to really understand what can be like a productive, I guess, in various different contexts, emotional response that can feed value, or that can be positive. And when emotions set you out of an experience or send you into moral evaluation or threat response, what is that? What are those thresholds? And really unpacking that and making sense of that is exciting to me, and something I've thought a lot about. And Trish and I got us thinking about shame and other moral emotions, and we're now writing a paper on shame. And it's not directly related, but it comes to the fact that we're really thinking about these ideas, and the fact that, and then the last part is, and that connects to that for me, and then is that the idea that it's not transgression or authenticity themselves that are good or bad, right? And just really thinking about, how does that relate to other concepts or ideas that we have out there that we think it's the concept. And because I work with stigma, I really like this idea of getting away from stigma being bad or good, and the experience of it. It's the experience and the emotional response. So I really am excited about those elements and spending more time thinking about them.
I just want to reflect a little bit on 2 things that you said. I think the emotional elements of this paper are nuanced and are interesting, and emotion researchers, there's so much interesting fodder for new ideas and pushing in new directions. And then the second is, that was one thing I really took away, that I immediately associated authenticity as positive and transgression as negative, and came in with that mindset. And through the process of reading this paper, had my mind sort of, I was doing mental flick-flacks in the sense that you were illustrating to me that, well, authenticity can be negative and transgression can actually be something that's positive and value creating. And so it was a very interesting process just in terms of reading it. And then, as you pointed out, thinking about, well, what else exists in that same guise, where things that we think are positive can be negative, and things that we think are negative can be positive. So I had some of that same sense in reading the paper. What else excites you about sort of paths forward or opportunities for future research from this paper?
Well, for me, besides the emotions piece, and Madeline talked about the shame thing that we're still working on, but for me, there's an element of social change over time and what happens to these over time as society changes. You think about, reality television and the idea of people sort of putting a camera on their lives. That's becoming more and more acceptable. But then there's also the flip side of these businesses are actually creating the social change in some sense. They're driving the social change, but they're also having to respond to it. So that idea, that tension between what's the role that they're playing in the social change, and then what are they having to respond to that they don't actually have control over, that to me is sort of an interesting thing going forward.
Yeah, without a shadow of a doubt. Reality TV 40 years ago didn't exist. Now it just keeps pushing the boundaries as to what's appropriate and not appropriate, and how far are we going to go. And so I think there's a lot to be said about how things change over time in terms of what's viewed as voyeuristic or not. Sean, what about you?
I'm going to actually build on that, because it's something we didn't quite get to in the paper, that I think that was one of the early things, was how these things can evolve over time. When we talked earlier about our 2x2 and how we just position, we go, MMA is here, and professional wrestling is here, and slum tourism is here. And we put it on the spots, but then we started to think, but you know what, when MMA first started, it was way over here in this quadrant, and now it's moved over here. And the processes of that movement, and we see we see destigmatization, we see research on that. But what I would really like to see is some of the things that we developed in the paper about managing audiences' emotions and that emotional optimization, how that unfolds over time, because that's a way into looking at the evolution of these things that I don't think I've seen in the existing literature. So that in particular, I'm fascinated by.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it just double clicks on what I've just said is really fascinating, and you elaborate on very interesting sort of ways of viewing that. What about you, Maxim?
Well, so three things really. So one, which kind of connects to the kind of work that I have done before and continue to do, which is sort of the centrality of human experience. Sort of that it's not the thing itself, but how we experience, how we interpret it, and and that's where such ideas as emotions and so on come in, and so it was very interesting to play with this in this context, which is really not something that I had given as much thought about until we started working on this paper. But the two other things that are kind of new for me was to really actually appreciate the prevalence of voyeurism in today's society, right? Where before sounds very ancient, but anyway, I'll continue with it. But before, in the older days, it was just tell me about your professional qualifications, etc. But no, now pretty much in every context, right? Whether it's like the bartender from whom who's pouring you a drink, or etc. Everybody's supposed to tell you something private about themselves. The person behind the profession. So and there's this element of voyeurism. I don't think I would have appreciated as much as I do now, if having worked on this paper. And then the other thing, the final thing that is, as a scholar, I've come to appreciate the value of phenomenon-driven theorizing, right? Which is this was a new experience for all of us, right? In the sense that, yes, I have written theory papers before, but I've never done a phenomenon-based theorizing, and this was a fun process, I think, for all of us. But it's also, I think, I've just realized that there is so much power to this phenomenon-driven theorizing, because there's so many different phenomena out there that really deserve grappling with, and really developing novel theorizing to understand properly. that we cannot do as well in the context of sort of the more traditional, how do we make a theoretical contribution kind of paper. And so this is something that's one of the things that I took away for myself as a scholar from this.
And that's a perfect lead into what I would like to frame as my final question, which is, if you've got a more junior scholar or someone who a colleague who comes to you and says, look, you've written this paper, it's a great example of phenomenon-driven theorizing. You saw the phenomena, you wrapped a theory around it, you sort of borrowed from certain places, made it, but utilized those things in novel and interesting ways, and were able to make a theoretical contribution for that through doing that. What would be one or two points of advice you would give to someone who wanted to try and do something similar? They feel they've identified an interesting phenomenon that is under-theorized, and they wanted to try and do something similar to help them facilitate the process of trying to develop a theory and write a paper that's associated with that phenomenon in some way. Are there any things from this project that you think would be useful points forward or points of advice that you could offer someone who wanted to do something similar?
Oh, that's a hard question. I think one of the things that helped us was that we really, different people on the team knew the literatures we were playing with really well. And I think if you didn't have that and were trying to do a phenomenon-based theory paper, you would veer too much into the empirical. It would be really hard, I think, to pull off making that theoretical hook and contribution theoretically if you weren't really in those literatures.
So you have to know what's there already to be able to utilize it, add to it, and recognize what's not working from what's there already.
Absolutely, yeah.
I also think that one thing that's important is that just because it's a novel phenomenon doesn't mean that it can drive novel theorizing. You know what I mean? And I think that sometimes the mistake someone can make is that you've not talked about this phenomena, but if you look, it could be explained by this. And what was at the core, what helped us all along is that there's this odd puzzle about explaining what this is. And it contradicted the theories that we happen, like Trish said, that we happen to know in this author team. So I think you need to make sure that what's the phenomena is as actually novel as you think it is at a theoretical level.
The phenomena generates a theoretical puzzle that you're then going to, in some sense, work towards resolving, and that's what your contribution is, as opposed to, it can just be explained by something that already exists.
One thing I'll add too is that for phenomenon-driven research like this, a conceptual paper, being able to go through all those examples, and I would say if anyone was planning on if they had a phenomenon that was really interesting, I would say dig into every example of that phenomenon you can find and put it through the ringer for what your theorizing is, because that ultimately really helped us refine our theorizing and make us feel like we are establishing credibility with what we were saying theoretically. And that is something I haven't done in other conceptual papers I've written to the same extent. But we had tables of MMA, slum tourism, erotic webcam. Does this apply? And if it doesn't, how do we refine our theory to do that? And so that's a tip that I wouldn't have thought about before getting this paper, but I came away with it.
But then the trap you didn't fall into was, because you've got the example, that's your theory. You still have to have the theoretical logic and argument that stands independent of, because MMA does this, that's an example of whatever, some sort of emotional optimization. I think that's an interesting tension. The examples are no doubt valuable, but they don't stand on their own as theory. They need the theory to layer on top of that, and for the theory to stand on its own without the example, to be able to make a contribution. So I think that's a very useful sort of aspect to point out, and then to recognize the tension between too reliant on examples versus no examples at all. You're going to land up in some sort of weird space.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we wound up doing and refined over the process was using the examples as a test. So it was almost to test our theory. We didn't always get it right through the whole process. We kind of leaned in different ways at different times. But by the end, I think we got that right, where it was testing, is this common in the different examples? What's not common in the examples and why? And what does that tell us for the theory? So we were really just testing our ideas in those examples.
Trish, do you think they were robustness checks? Is that what you were saying?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would also add just two quick things in regard to this advice, and I think this is something we really owe credit to our associate editor, to John Amis, is that which I appreciated more than ever now that you've asked this question about, like what how do we avoid some of these traps with phenomenon-based theorizing, right? Is that he kept on pushing us to really say, okay, so what's new? I guess what is the new theoretical takeaway? And he kept on pushing us on multiple rounds on this particular issue, because it is it is very easy to fall into the trap of simply sort of applying, and I think this kind of connects also to the issue that Madeline raised, right? That not every new context is generative for theory, right? And it's very easy to fall into the trap with a paper like this, where you simply explain what happens with a phenomenon, but you're really not coming back with new theoretical insights. And so this was very, very important that we were getting pushed on it. And I think this is something that I would suggest to future authors to really focus on, to really keep on thinking, okay, so what is this, what does applying theory to this phenomenon allow us to do for developing a particular theory further, right? But then also the flip side, which I think is also seems to be important, which I've noticed as a reviewer also on theory papers, is which applies not just to phenomenon-based theorizing like this, but also to other contexts, is that I think sometimes people don't quite have a handle on their own examples that they're trying to apply, and so their own examples are sort of abstract to them. They don't really get them, and so they don't do what they're hoping is going that those examples will do, right? And it seems in general that one of the worst things that can happen with with a theory paper in process, right, is that it becomes sort of too abstract, right? Like people say, okay, I can see what you're trying to do here, but I don't get it. I don't see how it would work either conceptually or in concrete contexts. And that tends to happen, I think, a lot of times when the authors don't themselves quite have a specific lived experience that they can kind of plug their theoretical constructs to. And in the phenomenon-based theorizing, in some ways, I think maybe that's the flip side of the other problem, right? Is that it's more avoidable. That problem is more avoidable because you are dealing with a context that presumably you know something about and you care about enough. And you're perhaps less likely to fall into the trap of ending up with a bunch of constructs that you don't actually know how they would actually operate in the real world. Yeah,
very well said. And thank you to all of you for your tips, perspectives, ideas around this, because I think you've lived this experience, and you've certainly had the advantage of being from your own empirical work, being close to certain of the phenomena that you reflect, but then have been able to really wrap around and advance an interesting theoretical perspective around this idea of commercializing voyeurism. So thank you. Thanks for entrusting your work to AMR. Thanks for participating in this AMR Origin series interviews, and thank you Trish in particular for being so patient in terms of wrangling and making sure we can have everyone from the team on this call. It was worth waiting for. I'm very grateful to each and every one of you for being willing to participate in this way. And I hope you will continue to contribute to AMR, to continue to write such interesting papers, and just be part of our community. So thanks very, very much.